Good evening, everybody. So if you guys have been with us for the last few weeks, then you know that we are back going through our study in Mark's Gospel. And tonight we are in chapter 14. Mark's Gospel has kind of been building to a climax. We've been kind of... It's been getting a little bit more exciting, and we've been slowly ramping up to something, and Mark is kind of dropping hints as we go, revealing a little bit more of what that something is as we kind of anticipate the climax coming. And tonight's passage shows us that the plot really just continues to thicken. But before we jump right into the text, if you would, let's pause and pray and just ask for the Lord's help as we open his word. Father, thank you that you have given your word to us, and as we open it up, as we dive back into the Gospel of Mark, as we wrestle through really a difficult passage of Jesus, of the Son preparing to go to the cross, as we come face to face with our own fickleness and our own inadequacy, I just pray that you would open our hearts, that you'd help us to see clearly, that you'd help us to rightly divide the word of truth and to hear what you have for us here in the scriptures, that we would come to it to be changed by it, not to ask it to support our own presuppositions, but would we read it and would we walk away looking more like the image of Christ, your Son. It's in his name that we pray, and by his name only that we come and make our plea. Amen. So at this point in the Gospels, Jesus has set his face to Jerusalem. It's one of my favorite phrases in all of Scriptures. Jesus has turned and set his face like a flint. He's got this steely-eyed gaze, and his bullseye is on Jerusalem, and there is something to be done. There's a mission at hand, and he is dead set on doing it. He rode to the city. He rode up to the temple, in through the city gates, through the streets of Jerusalem, up to the temple a few chapters ago in what should have been a triumphant coronation procession. But Mark tells us instead that he was received with very little fanfare. It's almost like Mark is signaling to us in his gospel, Jesus' triumph is coming, but it's not here. Not yet. Keep looking. And so we and the disciples keep looking, and we keep waiting for Jesus' triumphant moment. But strangely, as we have over the past few weeks, and as the disciples walked with Jesus, as we look for glorious triumph, Jesus has this odd habit of predicting his own death, which is not what you expect someone to do right on the precipice of triumph, is to drop the bombshell that they're about to die. We've seen this in a few different ways. Mary anoints him with expensive perfume, and Jesus says that his body has been prepared for burial. Jesus gathers for a meal with his 12 disciples, a Passover feast that should be a celebration of God's deliverance, and he tells them that he's being handed over to death. And then he drops the real kicker on them, that it'll be one of them that's handing him over. Last week, Steve walked us through how Jesus holds out to them the bread and the wine, and he teaches about his body and his blood that are about to be sacrificed. And so now we find ourselves here after supper. Jesus and his disciples have left Jerusalem, but this time they don't go back to Bethany to stay at the house of Lazarus like they have been in the habit of doing, but they go to the Mount of Olives. Jesus is clearly on a mission, but he's not on the one that the disciples anticipated. And along the way, as they walk to the Mount of Olives, Jesus drops another bombshell on them and says, all of you will fall away. As if it wasn't already bad enough that one of the 12 was the betrayer, now Jesus reveals that none of the 12 would hold their resolve. One of them will hand Jesus over to the authorities, and none of them will hold fast. None of them will remain steady. All of them will abandon him. This is what we we see here in our passage, starting in verse 26. After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "All of you will fall away, because it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." This strange juxtaposition continues of glory and death. Jesus and his disciples finish the Passover meal together, a meal that involves looking forward to, and anticipating the advent of Israel's Messiah. And then they sing together. They raise their voices to heaven, praising God. They make for the Mount of Olives, which, interestingly enough, like back in the Old Testament, when the glory of God departed the temple and the presence of the Lord left from Jerusalem, it departed here to these mountains east of Jerusalem, these mountains to the east. This is what Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 23 says. "The glory of the Lord rose up from within the city and stopped on the mountain east of the city." So as Jesus finishes the Passover with his followers, anticipating Israel's deliverance, as they sing with voices lifted together to heavens, as they climb the mountain to which the glory of God departed and from which they've been waiting for years for it to return, you would expect, you would be looking for, like all of us should be on the edge of our seat watching, because surely the hour of Jesus' glory has arrived. And Jesus says, all of you will fall away. The shepherd will be struck and the sheep will be scattered. But Peter obviously protests. Verse 29, Peter told him, "Even if everyone else falls away, I will not." Have you ever had the same thought? Like maybe you've had the same reaction that Peter has here. Have you ever then like afterwards had to deal with the consequences of going into something naively overconfident? Like going into something just pretty convinced that you're not susceptible to the ordinary pitfalls that most people are prone to. You know the cautions, you know what the experts say, but like that's for the average person, not for you. Surely not me. Like others maybe, but not me. So one of our neighbor churches in the city that we used to live in provided a 12-week marriage rebuilding class that Elizabeth and I went through together a few years ago. And so this is a room of probably about 300 people, and at least 2/3 of that room of married couples who were there attending this class on how to rebuild their marriage, at least 2/3 of them raised their hand when asked, how many of you knew that marriage counseling and conflict resolution was available and a helpful resource for couples that needed it, but just never thought that you would be one of them? Like you just never thought that you would be one of those. And at least 200 of the 300 people raised their hand that said, yes, like I knew marriage counseling was a thing. I just always assumed it was for the other people and not for me. As newlyweds thinking, there's couples that need to. Yeah, in fact, like most couples are probably vulnerable to falling into any number of bad habits and would be helped by something like that, but just not us. We're not most people, right? We're special. They just don't love each other like we do. They don't see what we see. Others maybe, but not us. Even if everyone else falls away, I will not. This is just a default habit that we're frequently given to. And Peter does the same thing. He says, these jokers maybe, but Jesus, I won't. No matter what happens, I won't. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, Jesus does not laud this. He doesn't praise Peter for his response. He doesn't say, finally, thank you, Peter, like one that I can count on, a real disciple among disciples that stands above the rest. Maybe this is what Peter's expecting, but it's not what he gets. Jesus doesn't berate Peter either. He doesn't lecture him on his pride and his arrogance. If anything, Jesus responds to Peter in this moment compassionately. But he doesn't commend him on his dedication. He isn't fooled by the bravado. pretty plainly and directly, Jesus just bursts Peter's bubble, levels with him about his insufficiency for what lies ahead. So this is what we see in verse 30. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, today, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." In other words, you aren't even going to make it through the night, Peter. Have you guys ever seen the show Alone? Elizabeth and I jumped on the bandwagon not too long ago. But it's basically a wilderness survival show where a group of contestants are dropped out in the wilderness on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and they're all left alone with some basic supplies, marooned somewhere on the island, and they have to see how long they can make it, but they don't see a single soul for the entire time they're there. They got to build their own shelter, find all their own food, maybe most importantly, just not go insane with their own thoughts. And whoever stays the longest without tapping out gets a huge cash prize. And so they carry around cameras, like filming themselves doing this the whole time. And it always starts, like the day one, all 10 of them, whatever, in their own little spots, hit the island. It always starts with them kind of going around with these cameras, just saying stuff like, "Oh, I found some little limpets here on the rock, and yeah, you can just pry these little guys off with your knife and get a few calories here and there, and this little weed thing that I found in the forest is really good for like cleaning your teeth with, and like I'm gonna have to get kind of real familiar with these snacks and these herbs, and like this is just where I'm going to be living for quite some time. It's not just a game to me or a contest for the money. Like I'm settling into a whole new way of life here." This is pretty much how everyone starts out day one. And then inevitably, within like a few minutes of landing on the beach, like one of those guys who is just waxing eloquent like Henry David Thoreau on his becoming one with the land, like hears something rustling in the bushes, and he's just like, "Oh snap, was that a bear? Like I'm out of this place, I'm going home, I'm getting some McDonald's, I'm getting a house that has no bears," and he's gone like an hour in. And they talk a big game, but when something goes south, they just don't have it. Like they aren't made of as stern of stuff as they think they are, and inevitably it happens. But Peter is different. He knows that he's got what it takes. So Jesus tells him that you're not going to make it through the night, Peter. But he kept insisting. He kept insisting, "If I have to die with you, I will never deny you." And they all said the same thing. The other disciples kind of join Peter in his assurance, each one insisting that this could never be. But Jesus has already made it clear, you just won't. You just won't, Peter. You won't even last 24 hours. You'll hear some rustling in the bushes, and before the night is up, you will be hitting the panic button and calling it quits. And before the night is out, Jesus' words will come to pass. We'll see as we go through Mark's gospel. Before the night is out, exactly what Jesus says come to pass. He's betrayed. His captors come to take him into the darkness. And this is what we read in verse 50. "Then they all deserted him and ran away." Jesus is arrested. Then they all deserted him and ran away. The shepherd is struck, and the sheep literally scatter. They head for the hills. Mark expounds on this, painting an even more vivid picture in verses 51 through 52. So they all deserted him and ran away. Now a certain young man, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, was following him. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. They are aggressively fleeing the scene. All of them, to a man, scatter and flee. Within a moment of hours, they go from, "If I have to die with you, I will never deny you," to running scared and naked through the night. Has this ever been you? Like, have you ever talked a big game, but headed for the hills once the pressure was on? When push comes to shove, will you turn away from Jesus and flee into the darkness for safety? Or will you stand firm? Will you hold your ground, come what may, and say, "Where he goes, I go"? Now, pause for just a second. That was a test. if your gut reaction was to say, yes, that one's me, that second one is me, you are making the same mistake that Peter makes here. Everyone else, maybe, but I will not. I am in category number 2. Because here's the thing. If that has not yet been you, if you have not yet been the guy leaving his cloth behind and running naked and terrified into the shadows, trying to save your own neck, if that has not yet been you, it will be. It will be. If you are the newlyweds that think you have found a love that is impervious to arguments, you will quite soon be arguing. If you are the parents that have transcended beyond frustration with your children, you will inevitably find yourself just ready to wring somebody's neck and put your head through a wall. If church membership, accountability, confession of sin, and repentance is for those other guys who just don't have the insight and the grasp on things that you do, you will very quickly find yourself abandoning, denying, and betraying Jesus. So what do we do? What is the answer? If that is inevitably us, what do we do? Are we just doomed to scattering? Should we just give up and stop trying? What is the point? What is the point of following if we all just go astray? Is there any hope? What I would say is this: yes, there is, but it's not in your resolve. There is hope, but it is not in your resolve. Here's your hope, your only hope. Mark 14, verse 28. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. When Jesus predicts the disciples' desertion, when Jesus tells Peter that he is going to deny him this very night, when he tells all of them that they will scatter, that the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will head to the hills, he tells them, he comforts them, but after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. When Jesus quotes this verse, he's actually quoting Zechariah 13 here in verse 27, when he says, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But Zechariah 13 is actually a promise of hope, that the sheep scatter, but Zechariah speaks about the Lord cleansing and redeeming his people. This is what he says in Zechariah 13. On that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the residents of Jerusalem to wash away sin and impurity. That's how that chapter starts. The sheep will scatter, but God will preserve from out of the scattering a remnant. In the very moment that God's people turn in sin and impurity to flee from the Lord, a new fountain is opened to wash away sin and impurity. That the Lord of armies himself will drive the unclean spirit from the land. This is what the prophet says down in verse 8. In the whole land, this is the Lord's declaration. 2/3 will be cut off and die, but 1/3 will be left in it. I will put this third through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name and I will answer them. I will say they are my people, and they will say the Lord is our God. As the sheep of the 12 tribes of Israel scatter, the Lord himself promises to bring them back. And here in Mark, as Jesus' 12 are about to scatter, Christ the Lord promises no less. The faithful God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has made himself known in Jesus, has come to dwell with us in Jesus Christ the Son. And he is still a sheep-gathering, remnant-preserving God. Peter's hope is not that he'll pass the test. Peter's hope is that the risen Jesus goes ahead of him. Your hope is not that you muster the grit to hold on to Jesus, but that the risen Jesus holds on to you. Luke, in his gospel account, actually gives us a really beautiful picture of this conversation between Jesus and Peter. If you flip over to Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 31. This is what Luke tells us. Same interaction between Jesus and Peter. Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Lord, he told him, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. I tell you, Peter, he said, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you know me. Simon Peter, Satan is going to sift you. Have you ever used a sifter? Shaking it back and forth as some things kind of filter through and the inner contents of whatever you're sifting are revealed? Have you ever felt like that was happening to you? Like a day, or just had a day or a week or maybe even a year where it felt like you were being sifted? Like you were being shaken back and forth with seemingly everything being turned upside down and inside out? Jesus tells Peter that this is about to happen, that Satan will be sifting. But not just Peter. The first you in this passage is plural. Satan has asked to sift all of you. All of you will be scattered like sheep without a shepherd. But then Jesus says, Peter, you specifically today will deny 3 times that you even know me. But here's the hope, here's the key, and this is the but that makes all the difference. But I have prayed for you, Jesus says. Your faith won't ultimately fail, not because it's super strong, but because I am holding fast for you while the sifting happens. You will scatter, all of you will scatter, but I prayed for you, and this you is singular. So when you, Peter, come back, when you are assuredly preserved and brought back by my faithfulness, strengthen your scattered brothers. In other words, you won't avoid the sifting. And if we are honest with ourselves, we won't avoid the sifting. If we lay aside our hubris and our naive self-confidence, we won't avoid the scattering either. But even when we're scattered, we have an advocate who stands in the gap on our behalf. Jesus himself prays that our faith will not fail. We are held securely by his faithfulness. He has risen. He goes before the disciples into Galilee, and he goes before us into glory. Make no mistake, as Jesus climbs the Mount of Olives here, he is taking the first steps into the moment of his crowning glory. It seems obscured, but this is the beautiful mystery, that strange juxtaposition that we noticed between glory and death. It's no accident. When we looked for and anticipated Jesus' glory and he just predicted his death, we didn't have the rug pulled out from under us. Our story seemed to be approaching its glorious crescendo, but then Jesus is predicting his death, talking about his burial, offering his body and blood, revealing that he's about to be struck and that all of them are about to scatter. And to be honest, like, the dismal outlook doesn't get much better over the next bit of the story. The night actually gets darker. Betrayal, arrest, false accusations, torture, murder. Like the next chapter, things don't get brighter yet. But amidst all of this, the message actually isn't, psych, there's no glory to be found here, only suffering. The message is that the shepherd's glory is in the striking. We're actually witnessing everything that we anticipated. The glorious, powerful, crowning moment of Christ the Messiah on the earth, establishing his dominant rule and reign of the kingdom over the powers of evil. It just doesn't look like we expected, but it's here. And it doesn't look like we expected because we have distorted vision. How many of you have to, at times, wear glasses? What would happen if we took a road trip together to go see the Grand Canyon? But along the way, while you grabbed a power nap in the back seat, I let Gilbert play with your glasses right after he had finished eating a peanut butter sandwich. So if you don't know this, every time we give Gilbert food, give him a piece of chocolate in the back seat to eat on a long car ride, he always makes the decision that he's just going to save it for a little bit. Which, if you know anything about how sun interacts through the window with a piece of chocolate sitting in the cup holder, it's just not a good recipe. So we arrive at the Grand Canyon, and you put on your glasses. Now they're just a little bit kind of sticky and smudged all over with greasy fingerprints. And what do you see? What is your reaction to the Grand Canyon? It's like, not really much to behold, is it? What a disappointing trip to come all this way and just see some like blurry, smudgy rocks and stuff. But what if you were to take those off and put on new glasses? You'd see majesty. You'd be left awestruck and speechless by the grandeur of it all, because you're finally seeing it how it is. This is what Mark is telling us. The glory of Christ is being put on full display. His procession up to the Temple Mount felt anticlimactic, but that's just because it wasn't the climax. The climax was reserved for a march up a different hill as Jesus goes to the cross. His body is anointed and anointed for burial. The Messiah has come to the Passover, just like anticipated. But what wasn't anticipated is that he's come as the Lamb, the one whose body is broken and whose blood is spilled. This is what we've seen passage after passage as we walk through the gospel. That the shepherd is struck, but in his death he strikes back. The shepherd is struck, but in his death he strikes back and he crushes the head of the serpent. And that as he has risen, he goes ahead of his people into glory. The shepherd is struck and the sheep scattered, but praise God because he is risen. And in so doing, he's dealt the death blow. So how should we respond to this? How do we apply what Mark is telling us here in this passage? The first thing that I would say is we fall on Jesus. Fall on Jesus. We don't like that, but remain ever stalwart and standing is not an option. As much as we like to believe that it is, remain ever standing without wavering is not an option. We will fall. When we do, let us fall on Jesus. If we're honest, that is not a comfortable thought. Just speaking frankly, we are really bad at humility and dependence. Maybe you hear that and you say, I don't know about that now. Like, I really do think that, stop. You are bad at humility and dependence. I am bad at humility and dependence. It is the core, fundamental rebellion of the human heart. Resist the temptation, strongly resist the temptation to say others maybe, but not I. Humility and dependence is a struggle for you. Don't jot down fall on Jesus on your bulletin notes, making a mental check mark that you've already got that one down. Don't hear fall on Jesus and think, oh yes, of course, that's what I always say. All of us should do that for sure. Read the words fall on Jesus and take a big breath, because you know that actually doing that and what lies ahead won't come easily and won't come naturally to you. Falling on Jesus will be hard, and it will make you do things that you don't want to do. First of all, it means that you're going to fall, and it isn't graceful. Falling isn't graceful. You can't fall elegantly. You can't look cool when you fall. And you're gonna do it. You're gonna fall, and all of us are gonna see it. All of us are gonna watch it happen. All of us are gonna fall, and each one of us is gonna be there to witness it. And it's not gonna look cool. It's gonna be embarrassing. It might even be more than embarrassing. It might be gut-wrenchingly painful. And you have a couple options. You can either keep that hidden. You can play that close to the vest. You can make sure to only engage and be known at a respectable distance. When your shame is exposed, you can leave the linen cloth and you can bolt for the shadows. Or you can shamelessly fall, ugly crying and undignified on Jesus and his church as the prayer and the care of the family of God hold you close. And I'm just going to confess to you and be transparent. I forgot this. A couple weeks ago, I forgot this. I failed to model this well for my family. Some of you may have noticed at church a few weeks ago, Coleman in a cow costume up front. I don't know if you did or not, but he was wearing a cow costume, sitting right there. We are here getting things at the church set up, ready for the service, and Coleman had a small mishap in the bathroom. He sat down on the toilet, but everything didn't make it into the bowl. Some of it kind of like shot out under the toilet seat and all over his pants that were just on the other side. And so I searched the car for a change of clothes, only to come up empty. And I ended up rummaging the church basement, and the only thing that I found was a cow costume. So I got him cleaned up. I changed him into the cow costume, and then I gave him the choice that he could either stay and just wear the cow costume for the night, or that Elizabeth could drive him and the other boys home, and they could go home and get dry clothes. And he said, will we come back to church after I'm changed? And I said, no, it's too far of a drive. You wouldn't have time. And he said that he told me that he'd like to stay. And so I gave him the option of just playing in the nursery until it was time for the kids to be dismissed. And he asked me, he said, won't I miss the singing together? And I said, yeah, he would, but I just didn't want it to be embarrassing for him having to wear the cow costume in here. And he looked at us, and very patiently, he said, well, yeah, Dad, it is kind of embarrassing. A cow costume isn't usually what people wear to church. And if they ask me why I am, I'll have to tell them that I peed on myself. But being embarrassed isn't a reason to leave church or not sing together. And we are bad at falling. And we're bad at falling on Jesus. We're bad at being vulnerable. We stink at humility. But being embarrassed is not a reason to leave church. Being embarrassed is not a reason to miss singing together with the people of God. And the Spirit of God humbled me and cut me to the heart. I don't fall on Jesus well. We don't fall on Jesus well. So let's together daily tear down the facade that we're all standing, and let's fall together on Christ. And when we have fallen together on Jesus, then let's turn and strengthen one another. The response to your insufficiency is not lose hope and give up. If you can't hold fast, just stop holding on. The first response is to trust Jesus to hold on to you. And then knowing that he does, hold on all the tighter. Jesus didn't say that he prayed for Peter so that Peter could just let go. He prayed for him that his faith would not fail, and that when he turned back, he might strengthen the brothers. So let's look at Peter. Peter says, if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And in the next 24 hours, he does the exact opposite. But Jesus preserves Peter. And over the next 24 years, Peter holds true. At the end of Peter's race, his lips still repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. In a stunningly beautiful conclusion, Peter at the end of his life dies with Jesus. Peter's literally crucified. He does not deny him, but he goes to the cross with Jesus. Even if everyone falls away, I will not. If I have to die with you, I will never deny you. The next 24 hours, Peter drops the ball. But for the rest of his days, Peter keeps this promise and strengthens generations of Jesus' church. How do we strengthen our brothers and sisters? How do we strengthen one another? What do we do? I think that we do the same thing that Jesus does for Peter. We show each other that we're insufficient. Show one another that they are insufficient. Compassionately bring them face to face with the manifest reality of their own inadequacy. Without this, how can we continue? Without this, we do inevitably continue the facade of strength without ever being strengthened. So love your brothers and sisters enough to hold up a mirror to their brokenness. Pray for them. Bring them to Jesus. He's the one who holds them and holds them fast. Entrust them to the one who is worthy, to the one who is worthy to be trusted. And then exhort one another, encourage one another to hold on to him. Don't settle, and don't let each other settle for cruise control. It's not worth it. It's too dangerous. Hold tighter, follow bolder and fall more fully on Christ. And do it because he's risen. Because he's risen and he is faithful and he goes before you into glory.